Hello, and welcome back to Writing Tips. This is the sixth video in the Story Developer series. I'm your host, Sherry. Feel free to reach out to me with your questions. I'm sorry for the excessive gap between this video and the last one. There's just so much information about character development. I reorganized this video multiple times, but finally I decided it couldn't be just one video. I broke it into two videos, and hopefully I've organized them both to give you a solid foundation in the art of character creation. Today's video will feature the difference between flat and well-rounded characters. Then we'll delve into what makes a good main character or protagonist. I'll discuss motivation, and finally, we'll use your character's motivations to build a well-rounded psyche for your protagonists. That's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Character is a huge subject, and I wanted to make sure whether you're a pantser, a plotter, or somewhere in between, you get a foundation for your characters to make them seem real. You want them to be dynamic, complex, unpredictable, compelling, and above all, memorable. Character development is a process that will probably take the whole length of story creation, but you can build the framework for distinctive characters that seem believable before you begin to draft the plot. Pantsers often need to do more work on characters because they ask so much of their characters. Pantsers frequently want characters to virtually write the plot for themselves. Characters represent the reader and their dreams. Most readers waste their precious time and die with the feeling they've fallen short of their dreams. Story functions to give readers the feeling they have a small chance, but a real chance, to fulfill their wishes. Your reader wants to be inside your story. Point of view characters hold a place for the reader and invite the reader into the story to pursue the story goal with them. How well your reader connects with and cares about your characters determines the success of your story. You must create a character the reader bonds with and cares about so they will follow your story to the end. Readers bond with characters if they understand who the character is inside and get on board with the character's cause. They feel his defeat at the crisis moment and his triumph at the climax. That triumphant feeling makes them want to tell someone about the story. They're so emotionally connected, they want someone else to feel the same victory. Anyone can be given a point of view in your story. Anyone or anything that can be given free will, can be imbued with the capacity for desire, can take action, and suffer consequences, can be a character in your story. For example, The Little Engine That Could features a steam engine as a main character. A flat character is like a cardboard cutout, easily summed up. Flat characters are two-dimensional and simple, based on a single trait or trope, for example, the grumpy old man, the loyal sidekick, which makes them feel stereotypical. They're also predictable. Their actions aren't surprising. They don't change or develop through the story, and they serve a specific narrative role, like moving the plot forward, revealing a clue in a mystery, or providing a contrast. For example, an amusing waiter who serves the main character at a restaurant, injecting some humor into the scene. A well-rounded character, on the other hand, takes time to develop so they will feel real. Well-rounded characters are three-dimensional, complex, having multiple traits, flaws, motivations, and a rich emotional life. They're unpredictable and can surprise the reader with their actions and their decisions. They undergo significant change and growth during the story. Growth is also called a character arc. They feel real to people, grappling with inner conflicts and flaws, making readers care. A good story needs to have a balance of round and flat characters. Flat characters are essential for focus. If you added a complex backstory and emotional inner life to every character in the story, you'd probably end up well outside any target word count for your genre. But more importantly, the reader wouldn't be able to figure out what were the important points of your story. The unimportant or walk-on characters would distract them from the main story. When writing a flat character, be a little cautious of cliches and stereotypical characters. A cliche is any element of the story that has been overused so many times it no longer has an effect on the reader. For example, buy now because this offer ends soon, or a haunted mansion during a stormy night, or rain at a funeral. A stereotype limits or controls ideas about a group, culture, or religion. Attributes of a character are boiled down to the point they deny the character's humanity in some way. Asians can't drive and take lots of pictures, fat men are jolly, those who practice the Islamic faith are prone to violence or terrorism. By contrast, you want your main characters to stand out and seem more real. That often means making them more rounded characters. Most flat characters are static, unchanged by the end of the story. But not all static characters are flat. Some of your main characters might not experience change by the end of the story, but they should be well rounded. So, how do you do that? The most important character is your protagonist. Your main character is the one with the will and the capacity to pursue an object of his or her conscious or unconscious desire to the limits established by your setting and genre. Some of the qualities of a good protagonist include empathetic. Sympathetic character is likable. Having a sympathetic protagonist is optional, but having an empathetic protagonist is mandatory. Empathetic is more complicated. It means a character that is like me somehow. Your character may share only a single quality with the reader, but that one quality has to reach out and strike a chord so that the reader instinctively wants the protagonist to succeed. They have to be willful. The main character has to sustain strong desire through the adversity and take action to cause meaningful and irrevocable change in order for the story to succeed. Willfulness may be masked by passive characterization, but deep down the main character has to have an innate strength that eventually surfaces. Truly passive characters make poor protagonists. They have to have a conscious goal. Without a goal in conflict, there is no story. Optionally, you can give your protagonist a self-contradictory, unconscious, or secret desire. Most memorable characters have a conscious goal and an unconscious desire. The protagonist is unaware of this motivator, but the reader senses it through the subtext of the protagonist's contradictory behavior. What the protagonist believes he wants is usually the antithesis of what he actually, but unwittingly, does want. Capacity. The protagonist must possess the ability to pursue the goal believably. Just as the reader doesn't know if their dreams will come true or not, the protagonist's capacity to succeed should be in the right balance. So it is believable they could succeed or fail. When they do succeed, the reader feels their triumph as a catharsis, as though they too have been tested and won something. Your protagonist has to be highly motivated in order to go through all the obstacles you and your antagonist put in their way to the goal. Motivation is revealed in the choices someone makes. The harder the choices, the more possibilities you have to reveal the character's deepest nature. The motivation to pursue the ultimate story goal must fit the character's persona. One person may dive out of harm's way. Another might plant his feet and start shooting. Much of what makes these two characters different is internal belief system and disposition. What do the characters want internally? One is motivated by survival, the other is obsessed with justice. Frequently, what people say they want and what they actually want are two different things. A young man may say he wants the beautiful girl in his class. What he really wants is to be noticed by someone important, or an idealized romantic relationship, or to be the knight in shining armor for a damsel. He might not know that he wants any or all of those things. He interprets all those things as wanting the beautiful girl. As the author, you must know both the outer material goal of the character and the character's inner emotional motivations, even if the character is completely unaware. What keeps your main character up at night? And what events caused his or her insomnia? For example, the character is shy around women because he is overweight, because he is an emotional eater, because his father was super critical of him as a child, and so on and so on. Dig deep, and when you get the answer to one question, use it to dive even deeper into your character's psyche. What is their fatal flaw? Ask how they got that problem. Drill and drill and drill some more, deeper and deeper. How does the main character's occupation serve his goal? Or is his job an obstacle to his goal? What would your character rather be doing? How did her family life contribute to her conflict and her goal? What baggage does she carry for her family? Childhood trauma? Manifestations in adulthood from that trauma? Who is unforgiven by your main character and for what? Family members? A priest? Herself? What prejudices does he harbor? What are his feelings towards his own society? How did he get these ideas? Susan May Warren has a scheme for developing a well-rounded character she reveals in her book, The Story Equation. I highly recommend this book as an adjunct to this and the next video. You, the writer, need to remain centered on why the character is willing to pursue their goal so doggedly, why they behave the way they do, what's their motivation. Discovering this why is part of the fun for the reader. Give the reader enough hints about something hidden in the character's past to propel them through the inciting incident. Give your protagonist some hidden motivation the reader has to keep reading to find. There are two types of motivation, positive and negative. To figure their positive motivation, ask your protagonist to tell you in detail the happiest moment of their life. Write it down. The backstory is everything that happened to the character before your story starts. Developing a backstory makes the characters seem real. They aren't just sitting around with no past, waiting for your story to begin. Consider the iceberg rule when creating your character. 90% of what you write for the character's backstory is below the surface, and only you know it. But that 90% makes the other 10% you show to the reader believable. Ask your character, what was the happiest moment in your life? And why is this moment so special? You need a specific, relatable, poignant scene. Specific so your reader can actually visualize the memory. Relatable so the reader can empathize with your character and bond with them. And poignant so the reader feels a keen sense of bittersweet regret or sadness for your protagonist. The character cherishes this memory and wants to feel that way again. Use this memory to generate the character's secret desire and their greatest dream. When a character shares their happiest memory with another character on the page, the reader bonds with the character and understands their secret. You'll use the desire and the dream to create the perfect happily ever after. While the happiest memory creates the happily ever after and pushes the character toward that ending, the character can't quite get there without addressing their negative motivations. Like the happiest memory, the character also holds on to their worst memory. The backstory nightmare is often the why behind the character's actions, values, choices, and the subtext of their dialogue. It is from this moment you will pull out almost all of the other ingredients of your character's story: their greatest fear, their wound, their flaw, the lie they tell themselves, their values, motivations, and the story question or through line. To find the backstory nightmare, first take a self inventory. What lights you up? What fascinates you? What drives you nuts? What problem do you want to get a handle on or solve? What images compel you? Nature? Fine art? What words warm your heart or make you cringe? It's always easier to write about characters and events you are passionate about. Now, interview each of your point of view characters. Start with your protagonist. Consider your own inventory for the protagonist. You don't want the protagonist to be just like you, but giving them some of the same interests can make them easier to visualize. Ask your protagonist, who are you now? You're looking for an interesting adjective and a distinct descriptive noun. The adjective should evoke an emotion in the reader. The noun should give the reader a tangible, real-world scaffolding on which to build traits, skills, and competencies. The two together form a character title. You can use this title in your logline and in your elevator pitch, possibly even the synopsis. Some examples are a wounded warrior, like William Wallace in Braveheart, or a simple-minded hero, like Forrest Gump, or an imprisoned heiress, like Rose from Titanic. Once you have a title for your character, ask the character why they chose those words to describe themselves. Mind the adjective. Does that word point to a dream or a desire the character nurtures but keeps secret? Does it imply a strong desire that could become a story goal? Or perhaps the adjective is darker, implying a past nightmare. Now, mind the noun. What does this particular word imply about the character? What's his attitude towards the word? Drill down. But why? But why? Until you get to a character defining moment in his or her past. Can you use this moment as a backstory nightmare? Your why question should result in finding out about the character's worst moment in life. The backstory nightmare needs to be emotionally powerful, unique to your character, and add a personal moment that sows the seeds of their rejection, fear, regret, bitterness. It must be an incident the average reader can relate to, and the reader's heart must be moved for the character. It must also represent enough motivation to push your character all the way through the middle of the story to the end. Don't take the first idea. Dig deeper. Often, It is not the main traumatic event, but an ancillary event that really matters more to the character. Not when his mother died, but when all the other kids' mothers made homemade Christmas cookies for the school bake sale, and he brought cheap store-bought cookies that no one bought. Ask, what lesson did you learn from this experience? When did you really feel the impact of that lesson? Ask the character to describe the experience in detail. Let the character tell you the story and write it down. It needs to be a story with a beginning, middle, and an end. And listen for the inflection in their voice, their words, their emotions while telling the story. Every point of view character needs a backstory, so continue the interviews until you have one for each point of view character. The emotional repercussions of the backstory nightmare is the wound, sometimes called the shard of glass, because once a shard of glass gets under your skin, it hurts every time you touch it until the glass is removed. Whatever happened during the backstory nightmare, the character doesn't want to feel those emotions at that intensity again, so the wound has never had a chance to heal. Because it still hurts when they recall the nightmare or even come close to feeling that way again, the character will protect the wound at all costs. This provides your character with the motivation for the bad choices they make from the first page. As writer, use the wound to do the maximal damage to your character. Use it to detour the protagonist from the change they need to make. In a romance, use it to create the breakup, and also the source of healing the two characters experience at the end of the story. The wound also frequently provides motivation for a misguided story goal. The inciting incident disrupts the protagonist's world. They can't ignore all the problems the nightmare has created for them anymore. All they want is whatever it takes to make things go back to the way things were so they can ignore the nightmare once again. But stories are about change, so things can't go back to the way they were. If you have a faux goal, you may need a mirror moment at your story midpoint. At that point, the character confronts what they are becoming and may switch to a more appropriate goal. The happily ever after ending provides some visual healing for the protagonist's wound. So ask yourself, what emotional hurt did the backstory nightmare cause? How did it happen? Why does the character hurt? What longing does the character have that is specific to this moment? What small gesture would help ease the pain of that wound? And what would heal the wound permanently? Hopefully by now you have a main character with a name and you're fairly clear on your main character's goal in the story. Sometimes the goal is called the external want, not to be confused with the internal need. I can never keep the wants and the needs straight, so I use the term goals and desires, which don't seem as similar to me. You want a clearly articulated goal that drives the character through the story. The character should realistically be able to achieve his or her goal. Additionally, the value of the reward versus the cost to achieve the goal should also be realistic. Expending vast resources to achieve a modest goal is difficult for the reader to believe unless the author makes a convincing case for how important the goal is to this particular character. An external want is transformed in the inciting incident into a noble quest or SMART goal. Specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. I sometimes refer to this moment as the birth because it is when the protagonist is birthed into the real story world. The goal is noble because the reader must be convinced that the cause is worthy and justifiable in the eyes of the main character. He or she wants to put right what went wrong or pursue something positive that has become necessary. The protagonist doesn't want to feel the backstory nightmare emotions at that intensity ever again. Their greatest fear is something that recreates the same scenario as the backstory nightmare on an emotional level. The greatest fear has to be something that could happen again. For example, if a woman is left at the altar, she won't develop a fear of the marriage ceremony, but she may develop a fear of rejection or a fear of feeling embarrassed and exposed. Because the character doesn't want to experience the nightmare again, they develop a deep seated fear of something specific and avoid situations that carry any risk at all of feeling the way they felt during the backstory nightmare. Often, we as writers pick a fear we relate to. That way, there is a kernel of truth to the story. That's what is meant by writing what you know. Make sure you pick an emotion and a fear that you understand and can wrap your brain around. Fear pushes the character back to their comfort zone, while their secret desire pushes them toward their goal. Use the greatest fear to create the story crisis or all is lost moment near the climax. In that moment, the protagonist believes that everything is lost and their greatest fear has come true. Use the fear to create a character flaw, the motivation for the self-defeating and bad behavior of your protagonist from page 1. They want to avoid the feelings experienced during the backstory nightmare at all costs. They make bad decisions based on their fear of those emotions. The character tells themselves a lie to hide their flaw from themselves. For example, our woman left at the altar, her greatest fear is rejection. Therefore, she doesn't put herself out there where she could be rejected again. She turns cold and standoffish. She can't admit she's doing this to herself. So the lie she tells herself is that she is unlovable. But the truth is still out there. Soon the lie is confronted by small inconsistencies or truthlets. The lie and the truthlets battle it out as inner conflict, creating a character arc. The character arc is how the character changes during the course of your story. The truthlets and the lie escalate their inner conflict until the crisis causes an epiphany that the lie is untrue. The character releases the greatest fear and all that comes with it, like the flaw and the lie. Releasing the fear allows them to change. They enter Act 3 as a new man. The fear prevents the character from doing something at the beginning of the book in Act 1 that they prove that they can do at the end of the book in Act 3. This grand gesture demonstrates to the reader that the character has changed and they are permanently rid of their fear. Finally rid of the fear, they gain their secret desire and they're happily ever after. At the inciting incident, two primary motives are born, keeping the character in pursuit of his goal, his greatest dream and his greatest fear. The flaw is the external expression of the greatest fear. It is sometimes known as the need. It is created by a strong fear of the suffering the backstory nightmare created, and it stands in the way of allowing the character to pursue their inner desire or their secret desire if the character is unaware of the desire. Whichever word you use, it all means the same thing. The internal, emotional, or psychological lesson the character must learn to overcome their inner struggle and achieve true fulfillment. The flaw is behind every bad choice, subtext in all the dialogue, and explains every contradictory action. The strongest flaws are birthed during the backstory nightmare. The backstory nightmare should also compel the reader just enough to follow the character on their journey and to root for the character's success. The flaw is a protective mechanism to prevent the emotions associated with the backstory nightmare. The protagonist creates behaviors he believes keep him safe from feeling those emotions. This creates a visual litmus test for the reader to show that the character has changed by the end of the story. That test is what binds together your internal character arc and your external narrative arc or plots. For male characters, the flaw is often based on an event from the past. They resolve to never repeat that same mistake. Female characters, on the other hand, have flaws that are often based on worry. No event happened to them, but something happened to someone else and they empathize with that person. Or frequently, the fear is that something bad will happen in marriage, to their spouse, or even worse, to their children. Ask your character, how is the fear expressed as a flaw? The backstory nightmare leads to a lie the character tells themselves so they don't have to face their flaw. The lie molds the character's behavior in Act 1. This makes the character seem fully formed when they walk onto the page in the first scene. The lie also determines the hints about how the character has it all wrong, dropped into Act 1 and in the early part of Act 2. This lie sets up the character's inner conflict as the truth seeps into the character's awareness. Conflict enables the character to embark on an inner journey toward change or a character arc. The power of the lie comes to a crescendo right before the character crosses the threshold into Act 3. The lie feels true, and the protagonist faces their greatest fear. The character realizes the lie is not true in the epiphany or great truth, just as they cross into Act 3 at the character change moment. Realizing the lie isn't true causes the character to undergo character change. Wow, that was a huge amount of information with a bunch of new vocabulary. So let's go over that visually, shall we? Bringing the positive motivation into a clear focus before we move on, the happiest moment creates the greatest dream and the character's secret desire. Those two things create the happily ever after moment at the end of the story, but they aren't strong enough to push the character into that reality. The worst moment of the character's life leaves them with a wound that never heals and a fear of experiencing the emotions associated with that moment. Sometimes these two are called the shard of glass because they feel like a shard of glass under the skin. It hurts every time you touch it until the glass is removed. The wound sometimes begets a false goal that is reanalyzed during the midpoint mirror moment, when the character has to face the hard truth of who they are versus who they want to be. That moment of self-examination frequently makes the character change their goal to be more in line with who they're trying to become. The greatest fear creates a character flaw to protect them from the emotions of the nightmare and a lie so they can ignore the flaw. But the truth is inescapable and conflicts the lie. The clash between the truth and the lie causes character growth. Until the all is lost moment, when the character experiences an epiphany and realizes the great fear is a lie. Releasing the greatest fear allows them to achieve a happily ever after, which is the reflection of the greatest dream. In order for your backstory nightmare to explain away your character's poor choices, the reader has to eventually become aware of the backstory. Sure, you could just tell the reader in narration, but that lacks any emotion, and the reader will likely miss the full impact of that nightmare moment on your character's emotional life. Other potential ways to reveal the backstory nightmare include a prologue. This is the least effective. If you use a prologue, agents and editors assume you don't know how to reveal backstory, and it takes the reader out of the timeline of your story. Flashbacks do lend themselves to an emotional telling of the backstory nightmare, but they have many of the same disadvantages as prologues. They interrupt the forward progress of your story, and if handled incorrectly, they can confuse the timeline of the story for the reader. They also signal to agents that you are using a crutch rather than integrating character development and history naturally into the ongoing narrative. You could show your character taking an unusual action, then the action is explained as an aside to another character. This method is outdated and deprives the reader of the emotional impact of the backstory nightmare. Finally, you could drop hints of a greater story in the past in the first few chapters to make the reader curious. Bits of dialogue or not wholly explained situations. Do not stop the story to explain the backstory nightmare. Have the protagonist tell their story to someone else early in Act 2. This will make the story stakes feel real to the reader. Keep the reader engaged with the story that you are currently unfolding and bond the reader to your character. Let's try and draw this all together by putting it on our story timeline. Sometime before the story begins, the protagonist experiences their happiest and worst moments of their lives. The happiest moment creates a dream that becomes the character's secret desire. The nightmare becomes the greatest fear, which in turn becomes a wound that can't heal because the character creates a flaw and a lie to protect it. The flaw prevents them from achieving their dream. The fear is shown at the beginning of the story as something the character is prevented from doing. At the inciting incident, something awakens the secret desire and calls to the protagonist to embark on a metaphysical journey to obtain the story goal. Initially, the character debates going on this quest. The character's greatest fear holds him back, while his secret desire wins out and pushes him forward. And at the transition from Act 1 to Act 2, the protagonist starts on their noble quest. This is the moment they are birthed into the actual story world, and so I like to call this scene the birth. The quest or journey implied is frequently metaphorical, and the character does not actually change locations. Instead, journey represents character change. In the actual story world, he encounters conflict. These conflicts reveal inconsistencies in the lie that he's telling himself. The character flaw's ability to protect the wound begins to crack. And at the exact middle of the story, the character becomes aware that the fault for his failure to achieve the goal lies with him in the midpoint mirror moment. The character's goal can change to a less selfish goal at that point. Conflict continues to escalate up to the crisis point. This point is sometimes called the all is lost moment, but I like to call it the death. That bookends the birth point at the beginning of Act 2, and this point generally marks the transition from Act 2 to Act 3. At this point, the greatest fear seems realized, and the lie seems true. Working through this moment results in an epiphany that the fear is false in some way. So this scene is also about the death of the greatest fear. The character releases their fear and all the baggage that comes with it, like the flaw and the lie. That marks the critical character change needed to achieve the goal. They enter Act 3 as a new man and have the ability to do what they could not in Act 1. At the climax, the antagonist and protagonist have their final conflict. The antagonist frequently does not realize the protagonist has grown and is bringing new abilities to the table. If the protagonist has the resolve to commit to their change, then they usually win the confrontation and are rewarded. The scenes after the climax show a glimpse of the protagonist's future happily ever after based on the dream their happiest moment created. I hope I've taken something fairly complex and given you a guide to creating a well-rounded character. Before I say goodbye, I have a little announcement. I've crossed my first benchmark. More than 20 people have subscribed to my newsletters. To celebrate, I want to give all my Writing Tips subscribers a holiday gift by the end of the year. Everyone subscribed to Writing Tips on January 1st will get a coupon for 20 pages of their work edited by me for free. That's 5,500 words. I'll do inline comments and an overall assessment of the elements of your writing with suggestions to make your writing more immersive for readers. Next time, we'll continue filling in your characters by talking about stakes and values, and then we'll talk about conflict and how that creates character growth and change, and we'll finish up by talking about how all of this creates meaning in a story. This time, there won't be a long pause before our next video, so I'll see you in a couple of days.